LLORONA. تترزمي.
We are talking The Legend of LLORONA. This one is directed by Patricia Harris Steele and stars Danny Trejo and Autumn Reeser. Now this is a low-budget indie movie, and you may have heard the name LLORONA before. Of course, this was a higher profile movie which was a spin-off of the Conjuring movies. And that came out, I believe, in 2019, and much like it did with The Nun, when that came out there was a kind of rash of nun-inspired low-budget horror films, and like that there has been a rash of low-budget LLORONA movies, of course, which there really wasn't that many before. And this is the latest one. It seems like somewhat late to the party, I have to say. And they're all kind of similar sounding names, it must be said. They kind of get mixed up in which ones are which. Anyway, so what is the basic premise of this particular story? It focuses on this American couple, and they go to Mexico for a vacation, I suppose, with their young son, and they're kind of going there to get over the death of, I assume it's like an unborn child, it's an unborn kind of daughter that has died in miscarriage. And the wife is obviously very kind of depressed about it, as you know, are the father and the young son as well. But they go there to try and get their lives back together. And while they're there, they're menaced not only by ghostly spirits, but also by the cartel. But of course the cartel is nothing when compared to the spirits of the undead, LLORONA being this kind of this female ghost who is kind of targets children and is known as the kind of the weeping woman or the woman in white, and has her sights set on this family's young son. What will happen? Well, we'll have to go and check the movie out and find out. So let's discuss this low budget indie version of the LLORONA story. What can I say that worked in this movie? Okay, I actually didn't think the acting from the majority of the actors here was too bad. Reeser, who kind of plays our main character, really, I actually think did an okay job as our kind of our central protagonist. Perfectly fine performance for a kind of a low budget indie horror movie. Thought the acting was absolutely fine. And I have to say I quite enjoyed Danny Trejo here as well. He turns up in so many films these days, and he's kind of normally a mark these days of kind of low quality, and he's in the kind of film for, you know, a scene or two and then disappears just so they can have a name on it. Here he actually is in the film a reasonable amount and is a true supporting character, and I have to say he actually makes quite an impression here as this kind of taxi driver who seems to kind of get involved in the kind of the ongoing situation with the LLORONA sort of character. And I quite enjoyed him in there as well. Now this, I believe, was filmed partially at least in Mexico, and I think this does benefit the movie having these kind of quite kind of like nice kind of settings and kind of like woodland areas and canals and things like that. I believe it was filmed in Mexico and Canada, but certainly there's some location shooting here that I feel benefits this. I think the LLORONA character is interesting because it's quite a kind of tragic figure, not necessarily downright kind of evil, but certainly has ended up being somewhat kind of malicious, particularly if you happen to be a parent. But it's an interesting kind of backstory, and that is kind of fleshed out in the movie as we see kind of flashbacks that kind of give ultimately the origin of the LLORONA curse and things kind of like that. So that was all, it's all, you know, fairly interesting. The movie is also quite effects heavy. This also comes at a price, which we'll be talking about in just a minute. But there is a reasonable amount of effects here. They don't shy away from having kind of ghostly effects. But let's transition to what maybe doesn't work, and let's talk about those effects. I think the thing that people will come away with the most here is the somewhat poor digital effects, and they are quite poor. Now, this is a low budget film. You know, expectation shouldn't be too high when watching something along the lines of this, but it really does kind of stand out at times of being kind of quite cheap kind of digital effects. The thing that annoyed me the most, I have to say, was the day for night shooting, because it's so distracting. and it's so much of it in this movie. So what that basically means is where there is scenes that are shot during the day, but they kind of, you know, they change the kind of the resolution and the kind of the filters to make it appear on film, in theory at least, that it's actually in the night. But it's so obvious when this is done, especially with low budget films, because you still see, you know, what is clearly kind of bright sunlight kind of on people's faces reflecting through the trees and things like this. It's not a good effect, and this movie does it a hell of a lot. And it's very distracting and really kind of lowers the quality of the film, I have to say. But outside of that, some people may not care about that. The actual LLORONA effects, I don't think look particularly kind of strong. You know, a lot of the time it's kind of like there's just sort of misty effects and then a kind of woman running around. I just don't think it kind of stands out as like a composite effects, if that makes sense. There are a couple of instances where we kind of just see like white material going through the water, and there are some sequences where I think they literally do use material, which I think looks quite good, but a lot of the time they still just use digital effects. I think, how hard is it to just have a little bit of material in the water, white material? I mean, why do you need to create a digital effect for that? Surely it's not that difficult to put some material in some water. I don't know, it seems to me that people these low budget filmmakers just kind of rely a little bit too much on digital effects at times, when a simple, you know, shooting practical, you know, thing could be easily kind of put together. Anyway, yeah, the actual makeup for LLORONA I don't think is too bad, but it's just a little bit cheesy and cheap with the kind of the digital effect, which I think are the poorest elements within the movie, and I feel that's what people will kind of complain most about here. The story itself is somewhat predictable. There are some very obvious kind of foreshadowing here, and kind of, you know, plot elements which are signposted so blatantly obviously, it isn't really a shock when things are kind of revealed as the kind of the film progresses. The cartel storyline seems kind of some kind of shoehorned in, I have to say. Maybe this is to try and give the movie a little bit of more running time and things, you know, other things happening. But it just feels, how it's going to tie into the characters just felt a little bit kind of like just kind of crammed in there, to be honest with you. In a way, the cartel, to be honest, would scare me more than a ghost. But this is not the film that I feel is really appropriate for it. I have to say, so the film does drag. It's not an especially long film, but I do feel it could have been just maybe had 10 minutes kind of cut out of it, just to kind of make it a little bit more punchy. I think the problem is the movie, once it starts getting going, it's just basically these guys like trying to get away, or, you know, the ghost kidnaps the son, they get it back again. The ghost kidnaps the son, they try and get it back again. And there's this kind of like back and forth, and then you don't really feel like it's really moving the needle in regards to any kind of narrative flow or plot progression. It's just this kind of like, they're either chasing the ghost to try and get the son back, or the ghost is chasing them to try and kidnap the son. And that's kind of the whole second half of the movie, it feels like. And I just feel like it needed a little bit more narrative, which I think the cartel things are supposed to do. But they don't tend to have a huge amount of impact on the actual story. And as I say, just felt like little kind of elements that didn't really lead to much, to be honest with you. I think the acting for the most part was okay, as I've said, but there were one or two instances where I feel there are some smaller parts here that maybe weren't particularly as well acted here. But for the most part, I didn't think the acting was so bad. The husband's kind of written out the movie, and I don't know if I think that storyline, without kind of spoiling what happens, would kind of lead in a particularly kind of believable path in regards to, if you think about, you know, the real life and kind of what happens in these kind of situations. Overall, I think it's certainly not a bad film per se, but it just feels like cheap and kind of unnecessary, I have to say. I mean, when you've got a higher profile movie like the kind of the LLORONA kind of, you know, Conjuring movie, that it just feels like this movie, if you've seen that, you're not going to get anything more from this one. because it doesn't really offer anything new or clever. It just seems to be a very kind of like bog standard, you know, haunting kind of movie with quite kind of poor, you know, visual effects and nothing else to really say on the matter. But it isn't. No, I wouldn't say it's necessarily bad, but just kind of like lackluster and maybe a notch below average, because I think the effects are. Especially the damn day for night scenes really do kind of like detract from what maybe would have been a somewhat passable low budget ghost story. But as it stands at the moment, I would say it's a 4 out of 10, just below average for me. Certainly not terrible. I think it's watchable, and you know you might enjoy it if you could have just aren't too demanding about you know, that type of thing. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.